do, and then I think we're set. All right, yeah. Committee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 5651, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the committee print? Seeing none, are there other amendments? Chair will recognize. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 5651 offered by Mr. Barton of Texas.
And the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you and Mr. Waxman, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Pitts know, I'm going to withdraw the amendment. So this is primarily an opportunity to give me a forum to speak on an issue that I feel very deeply about. The bill before us is obviously a bipartisan bill. It's a good piece of legislation. I am proud to be an original, or at least a co-sponsor of the amended committee print that's going to be voted on. But as I said in the opening remarks yesterday, through various capacities on the Oversight Subcommittee and the Health Subcommittee, I have been involved with the FDA for a quarter of a century, and it literally is the gold standard for drug reviews and protection of the safety of the public health in the world. So they're fine people and they work very hard, but they are not the most efficient. I don't think anybody would dispute that. And they very rarely perform to what they're required to by law. So the amendment that's been distributed is pretty straightforward. This legislation reauthorizes, or in some cases for the first time, authorizes user fees. I'm not an opponent of user fees if properly constructed. And in order to ensure, or at least to incentivize performance accomplishment, the amendment says in each of the sections of the FDA that use user fees, after the first year of this bill, if they don't perform to 90% of the goal in the bill, the next year they lose 20% of their user fees. Now, the intent is not to cut their user fees 20%. The intent is to get them to perform to at least 90% of the goal that they have agreed to in negotiations with the stakeholders. And it's a one-year review, and then the next year, if they don't perform, they'd get cut 20%, and then the next year. So it's not on a quarterly basis, it's on an annual basis. So that gives them a year, and then the review, and then if they had a cut, the cut would go into effect the third year. So there's enough time involved that I think that they could change the performance if they want to. So it's straightforward. Hopefully, if it were to be accepted at some point in time, it would, I think, go a long way towards making the FDA more efficient. And again, I stipulate that they're the gold standard for a drug review in the world. But some of these drugs take forever, and they simply don't perform, although each 4 or 5 years when we reauthorize them, they claim they will next year. So this would be a way to make next year actually happen. And I will yield to anybody that wishes to speak, or if nobody wishes to speak, I will withdraw the amendment.
Will the gentleman yield for?
Sure.
Briefly, I just welcome your continued participation with this bill. I certainly appreciate you withdrawing the amendment, and I just want to assure the gentleman and all members that this committee will continue its oversight to make sure that FDA does its job. That's part of the responsibility of this committee, and we feel that this legislation ought to help them do it in a more timely manner, and we'll stay on the case. I want to give the gentleman that assurance and all members that, and yield back.
All right. Mr. Chairman, then I would withdraw the amendment.
Amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Utah.
I'd rise to strike the requisite number of words to engage in a colloquy with Mr. Waxman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank you and Mr. Waxman for your work on crafting a bipartisan user-free reauthorization bill. It's a good bill. It's going to enhance consumer safety and increase predictability in the FDA's drug and device approval process, and I'll be proud to vote for this bill. However, there is still an outstanding issue that I believe we have a tremendous opportunity to resolve this year. I have worked to enact a national pedigree standard to better protect our pharmaceutical supply chain from counterfeiters since before this committee worked on the last FDA user-free reauthorization bill 5 years ago. A national standard is needed to ensure we are better able to keep adulterated or counterfeit products out of the supply chain and to provide a single standard as opposed to a patchwork system of conflicting states' laws, which would create regulatory and logistical hurdles for industry stakeholders. In this Congress, my colleague, Mr. Bilbray, and I have been working with a coalition of stakeholders representing all aspects of the supply chain, from manufacturers to distributors to pharmacists. This coalition, the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance, has worked together to craft a national pedigree standard that has the backing of all aspects of the supply chain. And I was pleased to see elements of the legislation that Mr. Bilbray and I introduced included in this proposal. Their work and agreement is significant because a national pedigree standard was not included in the 2007 FDA user-fee bill, largely due to stakeholder disagreement. Now we have a proposal with industry consensus, and it has bipartisan support in this committee. Now, there are still elements of the proposal that need to be worked out with the FDA, and I stand ready to continue to work with the FDA on those issues. Unfortunately, we could not come to a resolution in time for today's markup. However, those discussions are ongoing and yielding very promising and positive results. I would like to take this time to ask you, Mr. Waxman, for your assurance that you too will continue to work with me, my colleague, Mr. Bilbray, the FDA, and the Alliance on crafting final legislative agreement to be included in the user-fee authorization package that will enhance supply chain security but not be overly burdensome for industry and ultimately provide a more secure product for consumers. And I yield to my colleague, Mr. Waxman.
I thank you for yielding, and I thank you for your work on this issue. Ensuring the safety and integrity of our supply chain from beginning to end is a critical issue for this committee, and I commend the committee for including provisions that will bring important oversight to the increasingly global upstream drug supply chain. I also commend industry stakeholders on their efforts in coming together to present a drug pedigree proposal that is supported by industry at all levels. As we heard in one of our hearings on this issue, California already has a law that mandates a robust pedigree system that traces individual drug sale units from the point of original distribution to the point of sale, a feature that the FDA has identified as crucial to ensuring safety. I'm aware that many experts say that it is not currently possible to reliably track each such unit through the drug delivery chain, and that it will be impossible to implement the California law. Nonetheless, we know that California and many companies are working diligently to implement and comply with the law. We also know from past experience that such demanding laws can spur innovation and development of technology necessary for compliance. So we should not be satisfied only with what can be done yesterday or today. We need to think about what we will be able to do tomorrow and far into the future. I agree with you, Mr. Matheson, that we should continue working on legislation to create a robust downstream drug pedigree system to ensure the safety of pharmaceuticals from counterfeits and adulteration as they travel to consumers. I hope that we'll be able to reach agreement with industry, California, and the FDA on a national standard that will prove strong enough now and in the future to warrant preempting strong state laws that currently exist.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his assurances and look forward to continuing working with him on this issue, and I'd now like to yield to my colleague, Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And, Mr. Chairman, congratulations on this bill. I think just the discussion in the last few moments shows that, to everybody's astonishing around the world, is that bipartisanship is breaking out everywhere in this committee. I'm sure it'll be on the headlines and on the teasers on every station in America tonight. let's just say that I appreciate the leadership that my colleague has taken on addressing this issue, and I think that we've got to recognize we've got a real opportunity to work on this component and add to this bipartisan bill somewhere down the line. And as we all know, there's been a difference made where there's cooperation working not just between members of this committee but in the industry itself. We have language that can create a national pedigree system to replace the patchwork of state laws that are currently being considered or being placed forward. This legislation is a step in creating a secure supply chain system which will protect the American public and make sure that life-saving drugs and services are available to those who desperately need it. Look, I've worked on technology forcing regulations for decades. This is a very inexact science. There are ways we can push technology to respond, but we've got to be sensitive to reality, and I think that's what we're trying to do, is address this. Mr. Chairman, I understand that at this time the legislation could not be included in this draft that we have today, but I hope that we will continue to work together in order to finalize the legislative solution that can include in the final package this kind of agreement and the kind of consensus to go to the President for his final signature. So at this time, I'll yield to the gentleman from the great state of West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Congressman. I support your effort to establish a nationwide tracking and trace program on prescription drugs. I would request, however, that as we move forward with this discussion on pedigree, that we also include a study on e-labeling for prescription drugs. E-labeling could eliminate the requirement for paper information attached to the packaging of prescription drugs and move to electronic documentation. E-labeling has the potential of creating more efficiency for the pharmaceutical supply chain to make sure that pharmacists have the most up-to-date information on drugs and save the industry millions of dollars that could be spent on research. I'm asking for a study on this issue and not legislation because the concerns of this effect could have on small community pharmacies in rural areas and possible liability. Discussions have been held among manufacturers, distributors, dispensers, and the FDA on this issue for years, but no recommendation has yet been forthcoming. As we move forward on the pedigree effort, I ask the committee to please consider adding this to your legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
With the gentleman yield, I just want to commend both of you for your very hard work. This is a priority for me. A uniform national policy for track and trace is something that I certainly support, and I know many of our colleagues, if not all of us, support a plan that it would be absolutely necessary to protect our pharmaceutical supply chain and reduce unnecessary costs from the patchwork of state laws. Without such a system, weak links can be exploited by bad actors. So I want to thank all of you, and as the legislation moves forward, I commit to continue to work with both of you to make sure that we have an efficient and cost-effective track and trace pedigree system. Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman,
Waxman.
I'd like to just ask unanimous consent that the letter from the California State Board of Pharmacy dated May 9, 2012 be entered into the record on this subject.
Without objection. It's my understanding we have two brief colloquies. We'll try to get both of these done very quickly and have a roll call vote. Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we have an opportunity in the legislation that we are considering today to ensure that people with vision loss can access information on prescription drug labels. You shouldn't have to be able to see in order to be safe. But today, more than 25 million Americans experience vision loss that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to read the small print on prescription drug labels. Given that the incidence of vision loss is expected to increase as the baby boomers age, the consequences of being able to read prescription information pose a looming public health challenge. People who are blind or visually impaired can mistakenly consume the wrong medication, an incorrect dose, or an expired drug because they are unable to read the label or to distinguish between medication containers. They may be also unable to determine to detect a pharmacy error because they cannot verify the accuracy of a prescription label. Many blind or visually impaired are also forced to sacrifice their privacy and independence, relying on sighted family, friends, or even complete strangers to read the personal and sensitive information on their prescription bottles. All of these challenges lead to a loss of privacy, unnecessary illness, added emergency room visits, additional expenses, and increased anxiety. In 2011, I introduced legislation to establish a working group of pharmacists, patient advocates, and federal regulators who would issue best practices for pharmacies to ensure that people who are blind or visually impaired have access to prescription drug labeling. Under the bill, the working group's guidelines will provide answers about which options could best address the needs of the blind and visually impaired, such as large font labels or digital voice recorders attached to pill bottles. They'll examine what options are feasible for pharmacies of different sizes, such as small rural pharmacies. Unfortunately, we were not able to address this issue in the House version of the FDA Reform Act up to this point, but there is comparable language in the Senate version of the FDA bill, which I support, which I would like to see preserved in conference. With millions of Americans with vision impairments, I believe that we should ensure that they know which medication they are taking or are helping to administer to a child. Would the Chairman be willing to commit to working with me to address this issue in conference?
If the gentleman will yield, the issue did come to us late. As you noted, it's in the Senate language. I am very supportive of that concept. We need little time to examine the language more closely, but I absolutely commit to work with you and others that are on the committee that are interested in this so we can move forward.
I thank the Chairman. And may I say that in the bill before us today, it misses a key opportunity as well. It's a different subject, but to improve the safety of medical devices. I regret that the majority was unwilling to include any part of the legislation that I introduced with Mr. Waxman and Ms. Schakowsky to ensure that the FDA has the ability to reject devices if they're modeled after defective devices that have been recalled from the market. The Safety of Untested and New Devices Act wouldn't have required FDA to reject the new application, as we often heard from the bill's opponents, but rather it would have given the FDA authority to reject a device if the company could not show that the new device avoided serious previous flaws. Unfortunately, right now, FDA is legally obligated to clear a new medical device as long as the company shows it is similar to an earlier model, even if that model was recalled for serious safety problems. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this report prepared by my staff, which documents this problem and includes the stories of patients who suffered irreparable and avoidable harm as a result of these faulty devices. It's disappointing that we were unable, and the majority thus far has been unwilling to work with us to address this critical safety issue. But this is something that I plan to continue working on addressing in the future. I just don't think that we can allow these medical devices to stay out on the marketplace knowing that they are defective. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the committee mark includes a bill related to valid prescription. While federal law clearly defines a valid prescription as regards controlled substances, no such definition exists for non-controlled substances. The language in the mark is intended to close a statutory loophole being exploited by unscrupulous and dangerous online drug sites. We discovered, however, that the bill as currently drafted may adversely impact legitimate telehealth services. To ensure that this legislation restricts illegal online prescriptions but not undermine access to legitimate telehealth services, and as we look to cut health care costs, we must not inadvertently constrict medical innovation. I'll continue to work with members on both sides of the aisle to address this issue to reach a resolution before the House considers the user fee package.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I appreciate all the work that you've put into this issue for sure. I believe that we can collectively reach a resolution without adversely impacting innovation in the telehealth space, and I'll continue to work with you to find a solution as we continue to move the process. Does the gentleman yield back? Are there other members wishing to speak? Seeing none. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 5651 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. And the bill is favorably reported. The clerk will call the roll. Ask for a roll call vote.
Mr. Barton. Aye. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mrs. Bonamack. Mrs. Bonamack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes aye. Mr. Towns votes aye.
Good work. Good work. Have a good weekend.
49 ayes. That's 46. Okay. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 46 ayes, 0 nays.
46 ayes, 0 nays. The bill is passed, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 5651 approved by the committee today. So ordered. Chair thanks all members and staff. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.